The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells. Chapter 1. The Strange Man's Arrival. The stranger came early in February, one wintry day, through a biting wind and a driving snow, the last snowfall of the year, over the down, walking from the Bramblehurst railway station and carrying a little back portmanteau in his thickly gloved hand. He was wrapped up from head to foot, and the brim of his soft felt hat hid every inch of his face but the shiny tip of his nose. The snow had piled itself against his shoulders and chest, and added a white crest to the burden he carried. He staggered into the coach of horses, more dead than alive, and flung portmanteau down. "A fire!" he cried, in the name of human charity, a room and a fire!" He stamped and shook off the snow from himself in the bar, and followed Mrs. Hall into her guest parlor to strike his bargain. And what that much introduction, that a couple of sovereigns flung upon the table, he took up his quarters in the inn. Mrs. Hall lit the fire and left him there while she sat and went to prepare him a meal, and with over her own hands. A guest to stop at the Iping in the winter-time was unheard of piece of luck, let alone a guest who was no haggier, and she was resolved to show herself worthy of her good fortune. As soon as the bacon was well under way, and Milly, her lymphatic maid, had been brisked up a bit by the few deftly chosen expressions of contempt, she carried the cloth, plates, and glasses into the parlor, and began to lay them with the utmost eclat. Although the fire was burning up briskly, she was surprised to see that her visitor still wore his hat and coat, standing with his back to her and staring out at the window at the falling snow in the yard. His gloved hands were collapsed behind him, and he seemed to be lost in thought. She noticed that the melting snow had sprinkled his shoulders, dripped upon her carpet. "Can I take your hat and coat, sir?" she said, "and give them a good dry in the kitchen?" "No," he said without turning. She was not sure what she had heard him, and was about to repeat her question. He turned his head and looked at her over his shoulder. "I prefer to keep them on," he said with an emphasis, and she noticed that he wore a big blue spectacles with side lights, and he had a bush side whisker over his coat collar that completely hid his cheeks and his face. "Very well, sir," she said, "as you like. In a bit the room will be warmer." He made no answer, and turned his face away from her again, and Mrs. Hall, feeling that her conversational advances were ill-timed, laid the rest of the table things in a quick staccato and whisked out of the room. When she returned, he was still standing there, like a man of stone, his back hunched, his collar turned up, his dripping hat brim turned down, hiding his face and ears completely. She put down the eggs and bacon with considerable emphasis, and called rather, and then said to him, "Your lunch is served, sir." "Thank you," he said at the same time. I did not stir until she was closing the door. Then he swung round and approached the table with a certain eager quickness. As she went behind the bar to the kitchen, she heard a sound repeated at regular intervals. Chirk, 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 it went, and the sound of a spoon being rapidly whisked around the basin. "That girl," she said. "There! I clean forgot it. It's her being so long." And while she lay herself finished mixing the mustard, she gave Milly a few verbal stabs at her excessive slowness. She had cooked the ham and eggs, laid on the table, and done everything, while Milly, help indeed, had only succeeded in delaying the mustard, and him a new guest in wanting to stay. Then she filled the mustard pot, and putting it with a certain stateliness upon the gold and black tea tray, carried it into the parlor. She rapped and entered promptly. As she did so, her visitor moved quickly, so that she got but a glimpse of a white object disappearing behind the table. It would seem he was picking something from the floor. She rapped down the mustard pot on the table, and then she noticed the overcoat and hat had been taken off and put over a chair in front of the fire, and a pair of wet boots threatened to rust to her steel fender. She went to see the things resolutely. "I suppose I may have to dry them now," she said, in a voice that brooked no denial. "Leave the hat," said her visitor in a muffled voice, and turning she saw he had raised his head and was sitting and looking at her. For a moment she stood gaping at him, too surprised to speak. He held a white cloth. It was a serviette he had brought with him, over the lower part of his face, so that his mouth and jaws were completely hidden, and that was the reason his muffled voice. But it was not that which startled Mrs. Hall. It was the fact that all his forehead was above his blue glasses and was covered by white bandage, and another covered his ears, leaving not a scrap of his face exposed, excepting only his pink, peaked nose. It was bright pink and shiny, but as it had been at first. He wore a dark brown velvet jacket with high black linen-lined collar turned up about his neck, the thick black hair, escaping as it could below and between the cross bandages, projected in curious tails and horns, giving him the strangest appearance conceivable. This muffled and bandaged head was so unlike what she had anticipated. For that moment she was rigid. He did not remove the serviette, but remained holding it, and as she saw now, with a brown-gloved hand, and regarding her with his inscrutable blue glasses. "Leave the hat," he said, speaking very distinctly through the white cloth. Her nerves began to recover from the shock they had received. She placed the hat onto the chair again by the fire. "I didn't know, sir," she began, that she stopped, embarrassed. "Thank you," he said dryly, glancing from her to the door, then at her again. "I'll have them nicely dried, sir, at once," she said, and carried his clothes out of the room. She glanced at his white swathed head and blue goggles again as she was going out the door, but his napkin was still in front of his face. She shivered a little as she closed the door behind her, and her face was blockant of her surprise and perplexity. "I never," she whispered. "There!" She went quite softly into the kitchen, and was too preoccupied to ask Milly what she was messing about with now. When she got there, the visitor sat and listened to her retreating feet. He glanced inquiringly at the window before he removed his serviette and resumed his meal. He took a mouthful, glanced suspiciously at the window, took another mouthful, then rose and, taking the serviette in his hand, walked across the room and pulled the blind down to the top of the white muslin that obscured the lower panes. This left the room in a twilight. This done, he had returned with an easier air to the table and his meal. "The poor souls had an accident or an operation or something," said Mrs. Hall. "What turn them bandages did give me, to be sure." She put on some more coal, unfolded the clothes horse, and extended the traveler's coat upon this. And the goggles, why, he looked more like a drive-in helmet than a human man. He hung his muffler on a corner of the horse, and holding the handkerchief over his mouth all the time, talking through it. Perhaps his mouth was hurt too. Maybe. She turned around as the one who suddenly remembers. "Bless my soul alive," she said, going off at a tangent. "Ain't you done them taters yet, Milly?" Then, when Mrs. Hall went to clear away the stranger's lunch, her idea was that his mouth must also have been cut or disfigured in an accident she supposed him to have suffered, was confirmed, for he was smoking a pipe. And all that time that she was in his room, he never loosened the silk muffler he had wrapped around the lower part of his face or to put the mouthpiece on his lips. Yet it was not for forgetfulness, for she saw he glanced at it was smoldered out. He sat with the corner with his back to the window blind and spoke now, having eaten and drunk and being comfortably warmed through, and less aggressive brevity than before. The reflection of the fire lent a kind red of animation to his big spectacles. They had lacked hit Harrow. "I have some luggage," he said, at a Bramblehurst station. He had asked her how he could have sent it. He bowed his bandaged head quite politely in acknowledgment of her explanation. "Tomorrow," he said, "there is no speedier delivery?" He seemed quite disappointed when she answered, "No." Was she quite sure? "No man with a trap who will go over?" Mrs. Hall, nothing loath, answered his questions and developed in a conversation. "It's a steep road by the down, sir," she said in answer to his question about the trap, and then, snatching at an opening, said, "It was there a carriage was upset a year ago or more. A gentleman killed, besides his coachman. Accidents, sir, happen in a moment, don't they?" But the visitor was not to be drawn so easily. "They do," he said through his muffler, eyeing her quietly through his impenetrable glasses. "But they take long enough to get well, don't they? There was my sister's son, Tom, just cut his arm with a scythe, tumbled on it on the field, and bless me, he was 3 months tied up, sir. You'd hardly believe it. It's railer given me a dread of a scythe, sir." "I can quite understand that," said the visitor. "He was afraid, one time, that he'd have an operation. He was that bad, sir." The visitor laughed abruptly, a bark of a laugh that he seemed to bite and kill in his mouth. "Was he?" he said. "He was, sir, and that no laughing matter to them had the doing for him, as I had, my sister being took up with her little one so much. There was bandages to do, sir, the bandages to undo, so that if I may make so bold as to say it, sir." "Will you get me some matches?" said the visitor quite abruptly. "My pipe is out." Mrs. Hall pulled up suddenly. It was certainly rude of him. After telling him all that she had done, she gasped for a moment and remembered the 2 sovereigns. She went for the matches. "Thanks," he said concisely, and as she put them down and turned his shoulder upon her and stared up at the window again, it was altogether too discouraging. Evidently he was sensitive on the topic of operations and bandages. She did not make so bold as to say, however, after all, but his snubbing way had irritated her, and Milly had a hot time of it that afternoon. The visitor remained in the parlor until 4 o'clock without giving the ghost of an excuse for intrusion. For the most part, he was quite still during that time. It would seem that he sat in the growing darkness smoking in the firelight, perhaps dozing. Once or twice, a curious listener might have heard him in the coals, and for a space of 5 minutes he was audible pacing in the room. He seemed to be talking to himself. Then the armchair creaked as he sat down. Chapter 2. Mr. Teddy Henfrey's First Impressions. At 4 o'clock, when it was fairly dark and Mrs. Hall was screwing up her courage to go and ask her visitor if he would like some tea, Teddy Henfrey, the clock jobber, came into the bar. "My sakes, Mrs. Hall," he said, "but this is terrible weather for thin boots." The snow outside was falling faster. Mrs. Hall agreed, and then noticed he had his bag with him. "Now you're here, Mr. Teddy," she said, "I'd be glad if you'd give the old clock in the parlor a bit of a look. 'Tis going, it strikes well and hearty, but the hour hand won't do nothing but point at 6. and leading the way, she went across the parlor and rapped and entered. Her visitor, she saw as she opened the door, was seated in the armchair before the fire, dozing it would seem, with his bandaged head drooping on one side. The only light in the room was the red glow from the fire, which lit his eyes like adverse railway signals, but let his downcast face in darkness. And the scrunty vestiges of the day came through and opened the door. Everything was ruddy, shadowy, and indistinct to her, the more so since she had just been lighting the bar lamp, and her eyes were dazzled. But for a second it would seem that to her that the man she looked at had an enormous mouth wide open, a vast and incredible mouth that swallowed the whole of the lower portion of his face. It was that sensation of a moment, and the white bound head, the monstrous goggle eyes, and the huge yawn below it. Then he started up in his chair, put up his hand. She opened the door wide, so fast the room was lighter, and she saw him more clearly, with the muffler held up to his face, just as she had seen him hold the serviette before. The shadows, she fancied, had tricked her. "Would you mind, sir, this man coming into to look at the clock, sir?" she said, recovering from the momentary shock. "Look at the clock?" he said, staring around in a drowsy manner and speaking over his hand, and then, getting more fully awake, "Certainly." Mrs. Hall went away to get the lamp, and as he rose and stretched himself, then came the light, and Mr. Teddy Humphrey, entering, was confronted by this bandaged person. He was, he says, taken back. "Good afternoon," said the stranger, regarding him, as Mr. Humphrey says, with a vivid scent of dark spectacles, like a lobster. "I hope," said Mr. Humphrey, "that is no intrusion." "None whatever," said the stranger, "though I understand," he said, turning to Mrs. Hall, "that this room is really to be mine for my own private use." "I thought, sir," said Mrs. Hall, "you'd prefer the clock." "Certainly," said the stranger, "certainly, but as a rule, I like to be alone and undisturbed. But I am really glad to have the clock seen to," he said, seeing a certain hesitation in Mr. Humphrey's manner. "Very glad." Mr. Humphrey had intended to apologize to withdraw, but this anticipation reassured him. The stranger turned round with his back to the fireplace, and put his hands behind his back. "Presently," he said, "and when the clock mending is over, I think I should like to have some tea, but not till the clock mending is over." Mrs. Hall was about to leave the room. She made no conversational advances this time, because she did not want to be snubbed in front of Mr. Humphrey, when her visitor had asked her if she had made any arrangements about his boxes at Brumblehurst. She told him she had mentioned the matter to the postman, and that the carrier could bring them over on the morrow. "You are certain that is the earliest?" he said. She was certain, with a marked coldness. "I should explain," he added, what I was really too cold and fatigued to do before, that I am an experimental investigator." "Indeed, sir," said Mrs. Hall, much impressed. "My baggage contained apparatus and appliances. Very useful things indeed they are," said Mrs. Hall. I am very naturally anxious to get on with my inquiries." "Of course, sir. My reason for coming is to Iping," he proceeded, with a certain deliberation of manner, "was a desire for solitude. I do not wish to be disturbed in my work. In addition to my work, an accident—" "I thought as much," said Mrs. Hall to herself. "Necessities a certain retirement. My eyes are sometimes so weak and painful that I have to shut myself up in the dark for hours together, lock myself up. Sometimes, now and then, not at present, certainly, at such times the slightest disturbance, the entry of a stranger into the room, is a source of excruciating annoyance to me. It is well these things should be understood." "Certainly, sir," said Mrs. Hall, "and if I might make so bold as to ask. "That, I think, is all," said the stranger, with that quietly irresistible air of finality he could assume at will. Mrs. Hall reserved her question and sympathy for a better occasion. After Mrs. Hall had left the room, he remained standing in front of the fire, glaring. So Mr. Henfrey puts it, the clock mending. Mr. Henfrey not only took off the hands of his clock and the face, but extracted the works, and he tried to work as a slow and quiet, unassuming a manner as possible. He worked with the lamp close to him, and the green shade threw the brilliant light upon his hands, and upon the frame of the wheels, and left the rest in the room shadowy. When he looked up, colored patches swam in his eyes, being continuously of a curious nature. He had removed the works, quite unnecessary proceeding, with the idea of delaying his departure and perhaps falling into conversation with the stranger. But the stranger stood there, perfectly silent and still. So still, it got on Henfrey's nerves. He felt alone in the room and looked up, and there, gray and dim, was a bandaged head and a huge blue lenses staring fixedly, with a mist of green spots drifting in front of them. It was so uncanny to Henfrey that for a minute they remained staring blankly at one another. Then Henfrey looked down again. Very uncomfortable position. And would like to say something. He should remark that the weather was very cold for this time of the year. He looked up as if to take aim with what introductory shot. "The weather," he began. "Why don't you finish and go?" said the rigid figure, evidently in a state of painfully suppressed rage. "All you've got to do is fix this hour hand and it's on its axle. You're simply humbugging." "Certainly, sir. 1 minute more. I overlooked," and Mr. Henfrey finished and went. But he was feeling excessively annoyed. "Damn it," said Mr. Henfrey to himself, trudging down the village through the thawing snow. "A man must do a clock at times, surely. Yet again, can't a man look at you? Ugly!" And yet again, seemingly not. If the police was wanting you, you couldn't be more wrapped and bandaged. At Gleason's corner, he saw Hall, who had recently married the stranger's hostess at the Coach and Horses, and who now drove the Iping conveyance when occasional people required it to Cinderbridge Junction. Coming towards him on this return from that place, Hall had evidently been stopping a bit at the Cinderbridge. The judge was driving. "Oh, Teddy," he said, passing. "You got a rum up and home," said Teddy. Hall very sociably pulled up. "What's that?" he asked. "Rum-looking customer stopping at the Coach and Horses," said Teddy. "My sakes!" And as he proceeded to give Hall the vivid description of this grotesque guest, "Looks a bit like a disguise, don't it? I'd like to see the man's face if I had him stopping in my place," said Henfrey. "But women are that trustful where strangers are concerned. He took your rooms and he ain't given him a name, Hall." "You don't say so," said Hall, who was a man of sluggish apprehension. "Yes," said Teddy, "by the week, whatever he is, you can't get rid of him under a week. And he's got a lot of luggage coming tomorrow, so he says. Let's hope it won't be the stones in the boxes, Hall." He told Hall to follow his aunt at Hastings had been swindled by a stranger with an empty portmanteau. Altogether, he left the Hall vaguely suspicious. "Get up, old girl," said Hall. "I suppose I must see about this." Teddy trudged on his way with his mind considerably relieved. Instead of seeing about it, however, Hall on his return was severely rated by his wife on the length of time he had spent on the Sidderbridge, and his mild inquiries were answered snappishly in a manner not to the point. But the seed of suspicion Teddy had shown germinated in the mind of Mr. Hall in spite of these discouragements. "You whim, don't you know everything," said Mr. Hall, resolved to ascertain more in a personality of guest at the earliest possible opportunity. And after the stranger had gone to bed, which he did about past 9, Mr. Hall went very aggressively into the parlor and looked very hard at his wife's furniture, just to show that the stranger wasn't the master here, and scrutinized closely, a little contemptibly, in a sheet of mathematical computations the stranger had left. When retiring for the night, he instructed Mrs. Hall to look very closely at the stranger's luggage when it came the next day. "You mind your own business, Hall," said Mrs. Hall, "and I'll mind mine." She was all the more inclined to snap at Hall because the stranger was undoubtedly an unusually strange sort of stranger, and she was by no means assured about him in her own mind. In the middle of the night she woke up dreaming of huge white heads like turnips that came trailing after her, at the end of interminable necks, and with vast black eyes. But being a sensible woman, she subdued her terrors and turned over and went to sleep again. Chapter 3. 1,001 Bottles. So it was that on the 29th day of February, at the beginning of the thaw, the singular person fell out of infinity into Iping village. The next day his luggage arrived through the slush, and very remarkable luggage it was. There were a couple of trunks indeed, such as the rational man might need, but in addition there were a box of books, big fat books, of which some were just incomprehensible handwriting, and a dozen or more crates, boxes, and cases containing objects packed in straw. As it seemed to Hall, tugging with a casual curiosity at the straw, glass bottles, the stranger, muffled in a hat, coat, gloves, and wrapper, came out impatiently to meet Fairside's cart, while Hall was having a word or so of gossip preparatory to helping bring them in. Out he came, not noticing Fairside's dog, who was sniffing at the dainty of spirit at Hall's legs. "Come along with those boxes," he said. "I've been waiting long enough." And he came down the steps toward the tail of the cart as if to lay hands on the smaller crate. No sooner had Fairside's dog caught sight of him, then it began to bristle and growl savagely, and when he rushed down the steps, it gave an undecided hop, and sprang straight at his hand. "Whoop!" he cried to Hall, jumping back and forth, as he was no hero with dogs, and Fairnside howled, "Lie down!" and he snatched his whip. They saw the dog's teeth had slipped on the hand, heard a kick, saw the dog execute a flanking jump and to get home on the stranger's leg, and heard a rip of his trousering. Then the finer end of Fairside's whip reached his property, and the dog, yelping with dismay, retreated under the wheels of the wagon. It was all the business of a swift half-minute. No one spoke, everyone shouted. The stranger glanced swiftly in his torn glove and at his leg. He made as if he would stoop to the ladder. Then he turned and rushed swiftly up the steps and to the inn. They heard him go headlong across the passage and up on the uncarpeted stairs to the bedroom. "You brute!" he said Fairnside, climbing the wagon with his whip in his hand, while the dog watched him through the wheel. "Come here," said Fairnside. "You better." Hall had stood gaping. "He was bit," said Hall. "I had better go and see to him." He trotted after the stranger. He met Mrs. Hall in the passage. Carrier's darg, he said, bitten. The blind was down and the room was dim. He caught a glimpse of the most singular thing, what seemed the handless arm waving towards him, and a face of 3 huge indeterminate white spots, very like the face of a pale pansy. Then he was struck violently in the chest, hurled back, and the door slammed in his face and locked it. It was so rapid it gave him no time to observe. A waving of indecipherable shapes, a blow, and a concussion. There he stood on the darkness little landing, wondering what it might be that he had seen. A couple of minutes later, he rejoined the little group that had formed outside the Coach and Horses. There was Fernside telling about it all over again for the second time. There was Mrs. Hall saying his dog didn't have no business to bite her guests. There was Huckster, the general dealer from over the road, interrogative, and Sandy Wadgers from the forge, judicial. Besides women and children, all of them saying fatuities. Wouldn't let 'em bite me. I knows. Tasn't right have such dargs. What ye bitin' for then? And so forth. Mr. Hall, staring at them from the steps and listening, found it incredible that he had seen anything so remarkable happen upstairs. Besides, his vocabulary was altogether too limited to express his impressions. He don't want no help, he said in answer to his wife's inquiry. We better be a-taking of his luggage in. He ought to have cauterized it at once, said Mr. Huckster, especially if it's all inflamed. I'd shoot it. That's what I'd do, said a lady in the group. Suddenly, the dog began growling again. Come along, cried an angry voice in the doorway, and there stood a muffled stranger with his collar turned up, and his hat brim bent down. The sooner you get those things in, the better I'll be pleased. And it was stated by an anonymous bystander that his trousers and gloves had been changed. Was it you hurt, sir? Said Fernside. I'm rare sorry the darg. Not a bit, said the stranger. Never broke the skin. Hurry up with those things. Then he swore to himself. To Mr. Hall asserts. Directly the first crate was, in accordance with his directions, carried into the parlor. The stranger flung himself upon his extraordinary eagerness and began to unpack it, scattering the straw with an utter disregard of Mr. Hall's carpet. And from now on he began to produce bottles, little fat bottles containing powders, small and slender bottles containing colored white fluids, fluted blue bottles labeled poison, bottles with round bodies and slender necks, large green glass bottles, large white glass bottles, bottles with glass stoppers and frosted labels, bottles with fine corks, bottles with bungs, bottles with wooden caps, wine bottles, salad oil bottles, putting them in rows of the chiffonier, on the mantel, on the table, under the window, round the floor, on the bookshelf, everywhere. The chemist's shop in Bramblehurst could not boast half so many. Quite a sight it was. Crate after crate yielded bottles, until all 6 were emptied and the table high with straw. The only things that came out of these crates besides bottles were a number of test tubes and carefully packed balance. And directly the crates were unpacked, the stranger went to the window and set to work, not troubling in the least about the litter of straw, the fire which had gone out, the box of books outside, or the trunks of other luggage that had gone upstairs. When Mr. Hall took his dinner to him, he was already so absorbed in his work, pouring little drops out of the bottles into test tubes. He did not hear her until she had swept away the bulk of the straw to put the tray on the table. With some little emphasis, perhaps, seeing the state that the floor was in, then he turned half his head and immediately turned away again. But she saw, and he had removed his glasses. They were beside him on the table. and it seemed that to her that his eye sockets were extraordinarily hollow. He put his spectacles again, and then turned and faced her. She was about to complain the straw of the floor when he had anticipated her. "I wish you wouldn't have come in without knocking," he had said in the tone of abnormal exasperation that had seemed so characteristic of him. "I knocked, but seemingly. Perhaps you did, but in my investigations, my really very urgent and necessary investigations, the slightest disturbance, the jar of a door, I must ask you—" "Certainly, sir. You can but turn the lock if you like that, any time." "A very good idea," said the stranger. "This door, sir, if I might make it so bold as to remark, don't. If the straw makes trouble, put it down in the bill." He mumbled for her, words suspiciously like curses. He was so odd, standing there, so aggressive and explosive, bottle in one hand and test tube in the other, that Mrs. Hall was quite alarmed. But she was a resolute woman. "In which case, I should like to know, sir, what you consider a shilling. Put down a shilling. Surely a shilling's enough." "So be it," said Mrs. Hall, taking up the tablecloth and beginning to spread it over the table. "If you're satisfied, of course." He turned and sat down, with his coat collar toward her. All afternoon he worked with the door locked, and, as Mrs. Hall testifies, for the most part in silence, but once there was a concussion and a sound of bottles ringing together as though the table had been hit, and the smash of the bottle flung violently down, and then a rapid pacing athwart the room. Fearing something was the matter, she went down the door and listened, not caring to knock. "I can't go on," he was raving. "I can't go on. 300,000, 400,000, a huge multitude, cheated, all my life it may take me. Patience, patience indeed. Fool, fool!" There was a noise of hobnails on the bricks in the bar, and Mrs. Hall had very reluctantly to leave the rest to his soliloquy. When she returned to the room, was silent again, save for a faint crepitation of his chair and the occasional clink of a bottle. It was all over. The stranger had resumed work. When she took in his tea, she saw a broken glass in the corner of the room under the concave mirror, and golden strain that had been carelessly wiped. So she called attention to it. "Put it down in the bill," snapped her visitor. "For God's sake, don't worry me. If there is damage done, put it down in the bill." And he went on ticking a list in the exercise book before him. "I'll tell you something," said Farnside mysteriously. It was late in the afternoon, and they were in the little beer shop of Iping Hanger. "Well," said Teddy Henfrey, "this chap you're speaking of, what my dog bit. Well, he's black. Leastways, his legs were. I seed through the tear of his trousers that the tear of his glove. You'd have expected a sort of pinky show, wouldn't you? Well, wasn't none. Just blackness, I tell you. He's as black as my hat." "My sakes!" said Henfrey. "It's a rummy case altogether. Why, his nose as pink as paint." "That's true," said Farnside. "I knows that, and I'll tell you what I'm thinking. That marn's piebald. Teddy black here and white there in patches. He's ashamed of it. He's kind of a half-breed, and there's the color come off patchy instead of mixing. I've heard of such things before, and it's a common way with horses, as anyone can see." Chapter 4. Mr. Kuss interviews the stranger. I have told the circumstances of the stranger's arrival in Iping with certain fullness of detail, in order that the curious impression he may be understood by the reader. But expecting two odd incidents, the circumstances of his stay until the extraordinary day of the club festival may be passed over very courteously. There were a number of skirmishes with Mrs. Hall on matters of domestic discipline, but in every case until late April, when the first signs of penury began, he overrode her by an easy expedient of an extra payment. Hall did not like him, and when he ever dared, he talked of the advisability of getting rid of him. He but showed his dislike chiefly by concealing it and ostentatiously, and avoiding his visitor as much as possible. "Wait till the summer," said Mrs. Hall sagely, "when the artistes are beginning to come. Then we'll see. He may be a bit overbearing, but bills settled punctual is bills settled punctual. Whatever you like to say. The stranger did not go to church, and indeed made no difference between Sunday and the irreligious days. Even in costume, he worked. As much as Mrs. Hall thought, very fulfilfully, some days would come down early to be continuously busy. On others, he would rise late, pace his room, fretting audibly for hours together, smoke, sleep in the armchair by the fire. Communication with the world beyond the village he had none. His temper continued very uncertain. For the most part, his manner was that of a man suffering under almost unendurable provocation, and once or twice things were snapped, torn, crushed, or broken in spasmodic gusts of violence. He seemed under a chronic irritation of greatest intensity. His habit of talking to himself in a low voice grew steadily upon him. But though Mrs. Hall listened continuously, she could make neither head nor tail of what she heard. He rarely went abroad by daylight, but as at twilight he would go out muffled up invisibly, whether the weather were cold or not, and he chose the loneliest paths of those most overshadowed by trees and banks. His goggling spectacles, ghastly bandaged face under the penthouse of his hat, it came with a disagreeable suddenness out of the darkness upon one or two home-going laborers, and Teddy Humphrey, tumbling out the scarlet coat one night at 9:30, was scared shamefully by the stranger's skull-like head. He was walking hat in hand, lit by a sudden light of opened-in door. Such children as him a nightfall dreamt of bogies, and seemed doubtful whether he disliked boys more than they disliked him, or the reverse. But there was certainly a vivid enough dislike on either side. It was inevitable that a person of so remarkable appearance and bearing should form a frequent topic, such as village Iping. Opinion was greatly divided about his occupation. Mrs. Hall was sensitive on the point, which, when questioned, she explained very carefully that he was an experimental investigator, going gingerly over the syllables as one who dreads pitfalls. When asked what an experimental investigator was, she would say with a touch of superiority that most educated people knew such things, and would thus explain that he discovered things. Her visitor had an accident, she said, which temporarily discolored his face and hands, and being of a sensitive disposition, he was averse to any public notice of the fact. Out of her hearing there was a view largely entertained by that he was criminal, trying to escape from justice by wrapping himself up as to conceal himself altogether from the eye of the police. This idea sprang from the brain of Mr. Teddy Humphrey. No crime of any magnitude dating the middle or end of February was known to have occurred. Elaborated in the imagination of Mr. Gould, the prohibitory assistant of National School, the theory took the form of the stranger and the anarchist in disguise, preparing explosives, and he resolved to undertake such a detective operations as his time permitted. These consisted for the most part in looking very hard at the stranger whenever they met, or in asking people who had never seen the stranger, leading questions about him, but he detected nothing. Another school of opinion followed Mr. Farnside, and either accepted or the highballed view in some modification of it, as, for instance, Silas Durgan, who was heard to assert that if he chooses to show himself at fairs, he make his fortune in no time, and being a bit of a theologian, compared the stranger to the man of one talent. Yet another view explained the entire matter by regarding the stranger as a harmless lunatic, and had the advantage of accounting for every stray away. Between these main groups, the waverers and compromisers, Sussex folk have few superstitions, and was only after the events of early April that the thought of supernatural was first whispered in the village. Even then, it was only credited among the womenfolk. But whatever they had thought of him, people were in Iping, on the whole, agreed in disliking him. His irritability, though it might have been comprehensible to an urban brain worker, was an amazing thing to these quiet Sussex villagers. The frantic gesticulations they surprised now and then, the headlong pace after nightfall that swept him upon them around quiet corners, the inhuman bludgeoning of alternative advances of curiosity, the taste for twilight that led to the closing of doors, the pulling down of the blinds, the extinction of candles and lamps. Who could agree with such things going on? They drew as he passed down the village, and when he had gone by, young humorists would up the coat collars and down the hat brims, and go pacing nervously after him in imitation of occult bearing. There was a song popular at the time called "The Bogeyman." The Miss Stachel sang it at the schoolroom concert in aid of the church lamps, and thereafter, whenever one or two of the villagers were gathered together and the stranger appeared, a bar or so of his tune, more or less sharp or flat, was whistled in the midst of them. Also belated little children would call "Bogeyman" after him and make off tremulously elated. Cuss, the general practitioner, was devoured by curiosity. The bandages excited his professional interest. The report of 1,001 bottles aroused his jealous regard. Although April and May he converted an opportunity of talking to the stranger, and at last, towards Whitsuntide, he could stand it no longer, but hit upon the subscription list for a village nurse as an excuse. He was surprised to find that Mr. Hall did not know the guest's name. "He give a name," said Mrs. Hall, in an assertion which was quite unfounded, "but I didn't rightly hear it," she thought, and seemed so silly not to know the man's name. Cuss rapped at the parlor door and entered. There was a fairly audible imprecation from within. "Pardon my intrusion," said Cuss, and the door closed and cut off Mrs. Hall from the rest of the conversation. She could hear the murmur of voices for the next 10 minutes, then a cry of surprise, a stirring of feet, chair flung aside, a bark of laughter, quick steps to the door, and Cuss appeared, his face white, his eyes staring over his shoulder. He left his door open behind him, and without looking at her strode across the hall and went down the steps, and he had heard his feet hurrying along the road. He carried his hat in his hand. He stood behind the door, looking at the open door of the parlor. Then he had heard the stranger laughing quietly, and then his footsteps came across the room. She could not see his face where he stood. The parlor's door slammed, and the place was silent again. Cuss went straight up the village of the Bunting Vicar. "Am I mad?" Cuss began abruptly, as he entered the shabby little study. "Do I look like an insane person?" "What happened?" said Vicar, putting the ammonia on the loose sheet of forthcoming sermon. "What, that chap in the inn? Well, give me something to drink," said Cuss, and he sat down. When his nerves had been steadied by a glass of cheap sherry, the only drink the good vicar had available, he told him of the interview he had just had. Went in, he gasped, he began to demand a subscription for the nurse fund. He'd struck his hands in his pockets as I came in, and he sat down lumpily in his chair, sniffled I told him I'd heard he took an interest in scientific things. He said yes. Sniffed again. He kept on sniffing all the time. Evidently recently caught an old infernal cold. No wonder, wrapped up like that, I developed the nurse's idea, and all the while kept my eyes open. Bottles, chemicals everywhere, balance, test tubes and stands. And a smell of evening primrose. Would he subscribe? Said he'd consider it. Asked him point blank, was he researching? He said he was. A long research? Got quite across. A damn thing, long research, he said, blowing the cork out to speak. Oh, I said, and came out the grievance. The man was just on the boil. My question boiled him over. He had been given a prescription, most valuable prescription. What? Or he wouldn't say. Was it medical? Damn you! What are you finishing after? I apologized. Dignified sniff and cough. He resumed. He'd read it. 5 ingredients. Put it down, turned his head, draught of air, window lifted the paper, swish, rustle. He was working in a room with an open fireplace, he said. Saw a flicker, and there was a prescription burning and lifting chimneyward. Rushed towards it, and it just whisked up the chimney. So, just at that point, to illustrate his story, out came his arm. Well, no hand, just an empty sleeve. Lord, I thought, that's a deformity. Got a cork arm, I suppose. It had, and taken them off. Then I thought, there's something odd in that. What the devil keeps the sleeve up and open if there's nothing in it? There was nothing in it, I tell you. Nothing down it, right down to the joint. I could see right down to the elbow, and there was a glimmer of light shining through the tear of the cloth. Good God, I said. Then he stopped, stared at me with those black goggles of his, and then at his sleeves. Well, that's all. He never said a word, just glared, put his sleeves back in his pocket quickly. As I was saying, he said, that there was the prescription burning, wasn't I? Interrogative cough. How the devil, I said. Can you move an empty sleeve like that? Empty sleeve? Yes, I said, an empty sleeve. It's an empty sleeve, is it? You saw it was an empty sleeve? He stood up right away. I stood up too. He came towards me in very slow steps and stood quite close. Sniffed venomously. I didn't flinch, though I'm hanged and bandaged knob of his, and those blinkers aren't enough to unnerve anyone, coming quietly up to you. You said that it was an empty sleeve, he said. Certainly, I said, staring and saying nothing at the barefaced man. Unspectacled, start scratch. Then, very quietly, he pulled his sleeve out of his pocket again, and raised his arm towards me as though he would show it to me again. He did it very, very slowly. He looked at it. Seemed an age. Well, I said, clearing my throat, there's nothing in it. He had something to say. I was beginning to feel frightened. I could see right down it. He extended it straight towards me, slowly, slowly, just like that, until the cuff was 6 inches from my face. Queer thing to see an empty sleeve come at you like that. And then, well, something, exactly like a finger and thumb it felt, nipped my nose. Bunting began to laugh. There wasn't anything there, said Cuss, his voice running up into a shriek at the... There! It was all very well for you to laugh, but I tell you, I was so startled. I hit his cuff hard and turned around and cut out of the room. I left him. Cuss stopped. There was no mistaking the sincerity of his panic. He turned round in a helpless way and took a second glass of excellent Vickers very inferior sherry. When I hit his cuff and Cuss, I tell you, it felt exactly like hitting an arm. And there wasn't an arm. There wasn't the ghost of an arm. Mr. Bunting thought it over. He looked suspiciously at Cuss. "It's a most remarkable story," he said. He looked very wise and grave indeed. "It's really," said Mr. Bunting, a judicial emphasis, "a most remarkable story." Chapter 5. The Burglary at the Vicarage. The facts of the burglary at the vicarage came to us chiefly through a medium of the vicar and his wife. It occurred within the small hours of Whit Monday, the day devoted in the Iping to the club festivities. Mrs. Bunting, it seems, woke up suddenly in the stillness that comes before dawn, with that a strong impression that the door of their bedroom had been opened and closed. She did not arouse her husband at first, but sat up in bed listening. She then distinctly heard the pad, pad, pad of bare feet coming out in the adjoining dressing room and walking along the passage towards the staircase. As soon as she felt assured of this, she aroused the Reverend Mr. Bunting as quietly as possible. He did not strike a light, but putting on his spectacles, her dressing gown, and his bath slippers, he went out on the landing to listen. He heard quite distinctly a fumbling going on at his study desk downstairs, then a violent sneeze. At that, he returned to his bedroom, armed himself with the most obvious weapon, a poker, then descended to the staircase as noiselessly as possible. Mrs. Bunting came out on the landing. The hour was about 4. The ultimate darkness of the night was past. There was a faint shimmer of light in the hall, but the study doorway yawned impenetrably black. Everything was still except for the faint creaking of stairs under Mr. Bunting's tread, and the slight movement of the study. Then something snapped. The drawer was opened, and there was a rustle of papers. Then came the imprecation, and a match was struck, and the study was flooded with yellow light. Mr. Bunting was now in the hall, and through the crack of the door he could see the desk, and he had opened the drawer and the candle burning on the desk. But the robber he could not see. He stood there in the hall and undecided what to do, and Mrs. Bunting, her face and intent, crept slowly downstairs after him. One thing Mr. Bunting kept Bunting's courage, the persuasion that this burglar was a resident in the village. They had heard the chink of money and realized that the robber had found the housekeeping reserve of gold, £2, 10 and half sovereigns altogether. At that sound, Mr. Bunting was nerved to abrupt action. Gripping the poker firmly, he rushed to the room, closely followed by Mrs. Bunting. "Surrender!" cried Mr. Bunting fiercely, and then stooped amazed. Apparently the room was perfectly empty, yet their conviction that they had, at that very moment, heard somebody moving in the room had amounted to a certainty. For half a minute, perhaps, they stood gaping. Then Mrs. Bunting went across the room and looked behind the screen, while Mr. Bunting, by a kindred impulse, peered under the desk. Then Mrs. Bunting turned back the window curtains, and Mr. Bunting looked up the chimney and probed it with a poker. Then Mrs. Bunting scrutinized the wastepaper basket, and Mr. Bunting opened the lid to the coal scuttle. Then they came to a stop and stood with their eyes interrogating each other. "I could have sworn," said Mr. Bunting. "The candle," said Mr. Bunting. "Who lit the candle?" "The drawer," said Mrs. Bunting, "and the money's gone." She went hastily to the doorway. Of all the strange occurrences! There was a violent sneeze in the passage. They rushed out, and as they did so, the kitchen door slammed. "Bring the handle," said Mr. Bunting, and led the way. They both heard a sound of bolts being hastily shot back. As he opened the kitchen door, he saw the scullery that the back door was just opening, and the faint light of early dawn displayed the dark masses of garden beyond. He was certain that nothing went out the door. It opened, stood for a moment, and closed with a slam. As it did so, the candle Mrs. Bunting was carrying from the steady flickered and flared. It was a minute more before they had entered the kitchen. The place was empty. They refastened the back door, examined the kitchen, pantry, and scullery thoroughly, and went down to the cellar. There was not a soul to be found in the house. They search as they would. Daylight found in the vicar and his wife, and quaintly costumed little couple, still marveling about their own ground floor by the unnecessary light of the guttering candle.